Hi, my name is Kate Cullen. I'm a climate and water scientist and advocate, and today I'll be giving you a lay of the land of net zero commitments and seeding a few thoughts on our greatest challenges ahead. Before returning to academia, I came face to face with the climate crisis in very different corners of the globe. I spent 5 years working for community leaders on the front lines of climate change, from Cape Town, South Africa, to Sao Paulo, Brazil, Arusha, Tanzania, Santiago, Chile, and right here in California. I've worked in UN climate negotiations on behalf of small island nations threatened by sea level rise, and as a guide in Antarctica, educating visitors on how ice sheet melt contributes to that same sea level rise. I've seen not only the urgency of action, but to take it a step further, what an irretrievable loss it would be to humanity and the planet not to move as quickly and forcefully as we can. After decades of inaction and delay, in the last few years, we've seen remarkable progress on climate. The cost of green solutions plummeted, and governments and companies are setting net zero commitments at a remarkable rate. When done right, a net zero commitment means an entity is taking responsibility to do their fair share in halting the climate crisis by reducing emissions as quickly as possible and balance any remaining emissions with sinks or removals. About a year ago at the Oxford Net Zero program, we started asking ourselves, how equipped are these net zero plans really to catalyze immediate emission reductions and put us on a path towards our critical 2050 global net zero goal? To approach this question, we brought together an interdisciplinary team with backgrounds ranging from atmospheric physics to global governance, and partnered with our expert net zero tracker colleagues at the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. We surveyed targets made by more than 4,000 entities, including all UN-recognized nations, all cities with populations above 500,000, and every company in the Forbes Global 2000 list. So what did we find? As of late 2020, we found net zero commitments from nations to cities, states, and companies covered at least 61% of global greenhouse gas emissions, 68% of global GDP, and 56% of the world's population. At the level of national governments, we're making progress. 61% of countries had committed to net zero, adding another layer of accountability to their previous pledge to do so as Paris Agreement signatories. In comparison, the private sector has some catching up to do. When we looked at the world's 2,000 largest public companies, we found just over 1/5 have net zero commitments. Within the US, our data shows cities and states are leading the way. As of this February, 173 million people, just over half the US population, lived in a state and/or a city with a net zero target. We found net zero targets set by at least 17 states, 34 cities, and 132 companies. This broadening of ambition is so encouraging, but now it's time to deepen that ambition. Our findings show a wide discrepancy in the quality of targets. To define quality, we look to the UN Race to Zero campaign criteria for a net zero target. The criteria include pledging to have emissions by 2030 and reach net zero before 2050, planning the approach with a roadmap, proceeding by taking immediate action, and publishing progress publicly. A high-quality target includes all emissions, meaning all greenhouse gases, from direct to supply chain emissions. It also places limitations and conditions on offsetting, and centers principles of equity and empowerment. At a global level, many countries and companies are meeting at least some of these criteria for quality. 60% of net zero pledges include interim targets, 62 include a reporting mechanism, and 44% have a published plan. In the US, we found that only 11% of the US population is covered by a net zero target that meets all of these criteria, with New York State, Austin, Sacramento, Los Angeles, and New York City leading the way. For US companies, this robustness figure is very low. just 0.3% of US sales are covered by a high-quality net zero commitment. The takeaway here is we have a broad foundation of net zero ambition, both here in the US and globally. But the discrepancies in quality are significant, and the stakes couldn't be higher, so we have to address these shortcomings now. The three biggest challenges I see ahead of us are: 1, keeping a laser focus on immediate action and halving emissions by 2030, 2, transforming the way we approach offsets, and 3, folding equity into the core of net zero roadmaps. On immediate action, I'm sure you're aware by now that we're in a decisive decade, with only 8.5 years left before the critical milestone of 2030. If your organization doesn't have a net zero plan yet, what are you doing? Set it today. The new climate economy is here, and you're missing out on the transformation of our lifetimes. And if you have a plan, this is the moment today to strengthen it and take stronger action to ensure you're gaining the full benefits of being a front runner and accelerating that ambition loop for everyone's benefit. Moving to the offsetting challenge. This is one of the largest technological and governance challenges that we face. In our research, we found that only 53 out of the nearly 4,000 entities that we surveyed plan to reach net zero without the use of offsets. Only 127 entities have set some form of condition on the offsets they plan to use. This is a clear alarm bell that we need more transparency on the planned use of offsets, as well as rigor in our approach. Drawing from the Oxford Principles for Net Zero Aligned Offsetting, we know that offsets first and foremost must be used sparingly. But when they are used for the hardest to abate emissions, they must be additional, scientifically verified, and increasingly becoming permanent. Now to the equity challenge. What does it mean to operationalize equity, to set a target, quote, in light of equity, as the Paris Agreement says? Today, it's rare to see an entity grapple with their historic responsibility and set a pledge that represents a fair share of emissions reductions and use of removals. It's also rare to see funding and planning for a just transition actually included in a net zero plan. We don't have a shared definition of what equity means on all scales in a net zero pledge. And we have very few real-world models to build this definition from. This is why I'm leading an Oxford-Berkeley research group to do a deep dive on this question, and I would love to hear from you to discuss further. We'll certainly have the opportunity to discuss these three challenges throughout this conference. And to plug into their broader conversations, if you haven't already, join the over 3,000 businesses and hundreds of investors, cities, and regions who have signed on to the UN Race to Zero campaign, which has quickly become an accelerator of action and rigor for actors who are serious about the climate crisis. A link to the campaign's homepage is pinned in the chat window. And don't be a stranger. At Oxford Net Zero, there are a few things we love more than getting into the nitty-gritty of these challenges. So to wrap things up, as a young person and as a scientist, I'm asking you to move faster. Take bolder action than you think is possible. This global crisis is too urgent for us to waste a single day, and we have the privilege of being on the front lines of making this change happen. You have a whole community here at Verge Net Zero, at the Race to Zero campaign, and beyond to tackle these challenges with. In 2030 and then 2050, we can look back at this time and say, wow, we did it together as a global community.